On today's show, we'll be covering Bigfoot, angels, demons, and much more. All coming up on this episode of Paranormal Mysteries. Thank you for joining me and welcome. I am your host, Nick Ryan. I hope everyone's had a great week, and before we start today's episode, I'd like to thank Hannah for their support and generosity. And if you enjoy the show, please consider following, sharing, and reviewing the podcast. This supports us by helping new listeners to discover the show. You can also support us by becoming a patron at patreon.com/paranormalmysteries or by donating at buymeacoffee.com/paranormal. And if you'd like to share your paranormal encounter on the podcast, you can write to me at paranormalmysteriesPodcast@gmail.com or by visiting our website at paranormalmysteriespodcast.com. Or if you prefer to record your experience and send it to me, you can now do this on our website as well. You can also visit speakpipe.com/paranormalmysteries and record your story there. And remember that these links can be found in the show notes. And with that in mind, tonight's first story comes to us from Cassandra. And Cassandra's story is called Old Man James and Barbara, the Helpful Poltergeist. Cassandra says, "Good morning, Nick. The experiences I want to relate to you are about an entity named James and a poltergeist named Barbara. Let's start with James first. A number of years ago, I received a call from a friend, whom we'll call Gina. She had moved back in with her parents after a nasty divorce with her ex. She had a cat that was perhaps more sensitive to the paranormal than most, and one who preferred the company of grass to that of his human. She'd only been living with her mom for about a week when strange things started to happen. Her bedroom was in the basement of the house that was built in the late 1800s or early 1900s, something like that. In one corner of the room, farthest from the door, there was a rather large hole in the ceiling. My friend thought nothing of it at first, until strange things started to happen. Her TV would suddenly switch channels when playing a game. It would turn off without explanation, that sort of thing. Being who and what I am, I've shared a few instances with you before. She asked me to come over to get a feel for the place, to see what was happening. It was around midnight or so, and I had a glass or two of wine when she called. I wouldn't have gotten in my car if she didn't sound so desperate and afraid, as while I am capable of driving after a few glasses of wine, I'd really rather not. Fortunately, she only lived a few blocks from my house, so it wasn't that far to go. I pulled into the driveway to find her sitting on the porch. As my daughter and I got out of the car, she rushed over and threw her arms around me. She was trembling and clearly disturbed by what had happened. She said that she had had something thrown at her for changing the channel back to her favorite Doctor Who episode several times in a 10-minute span. Doctor Who is a great sci-fi show, but whatever was in her bedroom didn't approve of it. Passing through the doorway to her room, the air shifted. It was a warm summer night, but the temperature in her room couldn't have been more than 40 or so degrees. Closing my eyes, I let the other senses take over, guiding me and directing me to the source of the problem, if you will. I found myself sitting on the corner of her bed, directly beneath the hole in her ceiling. Looking up, I saw nothing out of the ordinary, just the bones of the old house above her. But I didn't feel normal. Opening myself up, something I don't recommend unless you're fully prepared for what can happen and have the training to prepare and protect yourself, I felt the presence of an older gentleman. He was angry, as though someone had just pissed in his Cheerios, kind of mad. I started off by asking him his name, and after a brief moment of hesitation, I got the response, James. I started to say okay before he interrupted me to state that his name was James, not Jimmy or Jim, but James, and firmly so. And then he began to relate his problem to me. James had moved out west from somewhere in the central U.S. with his family in the mid to late 1800s, sometime after the Civil War had ended. His family bought some land, 140 acres according to him, and built their home there as soon as they could afford to do so. The images I saw were breathtaking to say the least. It was wild and unruly, but gorgeous, as nature can be. In time, his family passed away, and he was left with the property to care for it himself. I never got the impression that he had a wife or children, just a younger sister that he called Katie. He loved Katie, but didn't like the man she'd chosen to marry. He called him a hoodlum and a filthy crook, fit for nothing more than feeding the fish under a murky pond of horse manure. James loved all things Old West, like the smell of saddle leather and sage in bloom. His favorite vice, though, was smoking a pipe. Sure, he'd have the occasional glass of whiskey, but he had too much to do around the place to have more than a drink every few weeks. His pipe, though, that was a nightly pleasure. I got the distinct smell of cherry pipe tobacco, and immediately I felt a sense of calm. It was something my grandfather used to smoke on occasion when I was growing up, and it was something comforting. I then began to see the way the house was set up, from the rocking chair by the fire to the hand-quilted blanket he kept draped over the small couch. It was very neat and tidy, though over time it became covered with dust. He was getting old, so simple chores began to tax him. He'd sold off his land to pay for increasing bills, until there was little more than an acre left. It was saddening to him, as he'd wanted it to be something he could pass on to his sister's children. When things got to be too much for him to take care of, his sister hired someone to look after him. At first, James was against it and made the poor woman's job harder than it needed to be. I then felt a sharp stab of pain in my chest, which crawled down my left arm. I gasped for breath as it came from nowhere. I saw James fall to the floor, clutching his chest, and I knew that it had to be a heart attack that had killed him, right in the corner of the room where the hole in the ceiling was. It had taken days for him to be found, as his helper hadn't stopped by in a while. It was his sister Katie that had found him, but the anger at the other woman for not being there when she should have was palpable. I asked James what he needed to help him find peace, so that he could move on. He told me that if Gina put some cherry pipe tobacco on the windowsill, a horseshoe above her bedroom door, and something old made of leather, he wouldn't make her life the hell he was creating for her. Gina said she would, just as her mother walked into the room. When her mother asked what was going on, Gina told her, and Kari, her mother, paled. She too had a brother named James that didn't want to be called anything other than that, and he'd also smoked cherry pipe tobacco. As Kari related the experience as a child in that house growing up, she said that she would catch the hint of the pipe smoke here and there. It was as though she was watching time repeat itself in that old house, the past and the present meeting up once again. I told Gina what all he needed, and that he would be okay with her watching her movies and playing her video games, if she at least played some old music or watched a Western movie once in a while. He didn't like what younger people called music, as it was just loud and ridiculous. Once she'd gotten those things for him, she had little trouble with him at all. Eventually, James moved on, and Gina's room has been calm ever since. Cassandra's next story is called Barbara the Helpful Poltergeist. And Cassandra says, "A few years ago I moved from one state to another, leaving a large apartment for something much smaller because my oldest daughter needed her mommy. When a grown woman asks for a parent to move closer, if it's possible, the parent does so. She'd had a really rough year, with several friends passing away by one way or another, and just didn't want to be so far away from those that she loved, in case anything else happened. After we got settled into our new place, one that we would later call the Holiday Hell Apartments because of the awful management practices and lack of maintenance or pest control and high crime rate, I began to notice strange things going on. I would walk out of my room and close a door, only to have that door swing open minutes later. Since it was just myself and my youngest daughter, I know it wasn't her opening things. It started off small, like the occasional bedroom door, to the cupboards and kitchen drawers. I didn't feel threatened by the presence, quite the contrary. It was calming and seemed to only want to help. I'd be cooking something for dinner, and I would need to get a spoon or a ladle out of a particular drawer, only to have that drawer open just as I was reaching for the handle. And since I'm not telekinetic, I knew it was her. Barbara liked to play pranks too. Nothing serious or dangerous, just the kind of thing like moving your car keys from one side of the table to the next, or laying your empty coffee cup on its side. And she also liked to blow papers around, just for the sake of doing so. One particular night, I heard my dog, a pit bull, whine in fear. She'd come running to my bedroom door, whimpering and pawing to come in. Fierce, right? A pit bull afraid of its own shadow, go figure. I got up to let her in, only to hear voices outside my door. The lock was being messed with, so I knew that someone was trying to break in. All of a sudden, I hear one of the guys say, "What the hell is that?" And shortly after, I heard them scream in terror. One of the guys said that the ghost was going to kill them, and they fled right away. I moved silently towards the door with a shillelagh in my hand, scared that they would break in anyway, only to see a wispy apparition move through the door toward me. I got the sense that she was smiling before she disappeared, easing my fear completely. I later learned that there had been 3 break-ins that night before mine, though it stopped with my unit. It was several days before there was any other activity, and when it resumed, it was very minor to begin with. Whatever she had done that night had taken quite a toll on her. When we finally had the opportunity to move, we invited her to come with us, and once we'd settled in, we noticed activity starting again. We had smudged the place before we began bringing our belongings in, so we knew that it wasn't anything that was there prior to our taking occupancy of the residence. I knew it was Barbara, though, as the same things began happening here. Drawers would open for me to grab utensils, papers would move from one table to the other, and my coffee cup would be placed on its side, just like in our other place. Not all entities are dark. Some just want to play, while others just want to be as helpful as they can. We never knew what happened to Barbara in life, but we sure enjoy having her around. We hope she stays with us for a while, if only so that we can find out what's keeping her tied to this plane of existence, so that she can move on. Thanks for reading, and I hope you and your family are staying healthy and safe during this pandemic. And thanks for all that you do. Cass. Our next story comes to us from Caroline, and Caroline says, "Hi Nick, I've had Spotify for some time and didn't really use it, but my daughter told me about podcasts, so I've been binge listening to your channel for several days now. Brilliant stuff. I don't know which category to place my story in, but it's definitely strange. So here goes. 17 years ago, I was a single mom to a 4-year-old little girl. I had recently left a terrible relationship and wanted to make a fresh start somewhere nice. I found a little home to rent in a village called Healing on the outskirts of a town called Grimsby. The house was called 3 Webster Mews. It had no garden, but was close to shops and the primary school was highly sought after. I placed the deposit and was set to move in. However, the agent who let the house contacted me to advise that there was another house just up for rent, further down the road, slightly cheaper with a garden, and did I want to view it, which of course I did. I viewed the house and fell in love with it. The agents let me cancel the Webster Mews house, and I swiftly moved into the better house on Station Road. We moved there in September of 2003 and settled in beautifully. My daughter enjoyed her school and made new friends. In February 2004, while walking my daughter to school, the route took us past Webster Mews. There were TV cameras around outside the Webster Mews house, and I was approached by a lady TV presenter, and she asked me my thoughts on the murders that occurred there the day before. I knew nothing about it, so I declined to comment, and I walked on. At the school gates, I met with other parents and learned that a 33-year-old woman and 2 of her younger daughters were stabbed to death at about 4 p.m. the day earlier inside 4 Webster Mews. The perpetrator took the youngest baby in his car and drove to the Humber Bridge and jumped off, but thankfully he left the child unharmed in his car. They lived right next door to the house I almost lived in. Crikey, I would have easily befriended that lady. I was at work the day the murders happened, so she could well have offered to collect my daughter from school with her own daughters. I dread to think what could have been. Anyway, fast forward 5 days. I received a letter through my door informing me that my landlady had unforeseen circumstances and needed to sell my house. I was devastated. I loved that house. I had 8 weeks' notice to move out. The agents tried to reassure me and advised me that the tenant at my old buddy, 3 Webster Mews, had decided to move out, and I wonder if the murders next door had any influence on that decision. Very reluctant to agree, I decided to move in as I didn't want to change my daughter's school again, and thankfully I didn't have to move. A wonderful lady bought my Station Road home to rent, and she kept me in it. We lived there happily for 14 years. Was my daughter being protected by angels? I think so. 2 years later, I was still suffering terribly from the bad relationship breakup. It took a toll on my mental health, and I began to think about suicide. The thoughts got more intense and constant, and I finally began to feel peaceful when thinking about my death, and that's when I started to plan it. I live near a train track, and my plan was to take a cocktail of alcohol and wait for the last train at 10:30 p.m. It was mid-November, so very dark at the time, and no one would see me to stop me. As I laid in my bed planning whether to face the train or not for the hit, a male voice said the word April close to my ear. I shot up out of bed scared, and I went downstairs. I wondered if my dad had died and his ghost was present with me. I rang him, but he was fine. The voice scared me so much I didn't dare think about suicide again, and come April, I was offered a fabulous job out of the blue by one of my daughter's friend's parents. He was a doctor and needed an administrator. I jumped at the chance, and being a non-skilled person, I thought working in healthcare would be very interesting. 15 years on to present day, I am now a nurse, and I completely understand what the voice meant when saying April that night. Nursing was my path, not death. I guess the angel knew how serious I was, and he wanted me to stop. I am thankful he did. Many thanks for reading. I have never told anyone about the suicide story. My daughter knows about the house and the murders, and she finds it fascinating and frightening at the same time. I guess our time wasn't meant to end back then. Regards, Caroline. Our next story of the night comes from Tara, and Tara's story is called Bigfoot and Shadow Man. Tara says, I got my husband onto true crime podcasts, and when he got tired of listening to all that constant evil that lives in people who hurt their children, he found your show. Shortly after he started listening, he got me hooked, and here are a couple stories of possible Bigfoot sounds, and possibly a Shadow Man. We were camping for Easter in the Sam Houston National Forest this year, as we have for the last 2 years, this making it the third. My husband stumbled across a site a few years ago and found out that there has been Bigfoot sightings in this area for years. We just kept it in the back of our mind. However, this year he had already started to listen to Bigfoot sounds on your show, and he told me I had to check them out, because one night sitting around the campfire, we heard a pack of coyotes, which we hear nightly, and then another pack that sounded similar, but wasn't quite the same. Therefore, it left us wondering if it was in fact a Bigfoot that we were hearing. I am sensitive and have been binging your episodes, so I've been learning a lot. Like most others that were sensitive when they were kids, I would have nightmares and sleep at the foot of my parents' bed, and one night, I even saw a spirit. Also, like many others, I was always told it was my imagination. It wasn't until I got older and my mom told me that there was in fact a spirit that lived there, and her and my dad had seen it, but they didn't want to scare me. I don't remember exactly how old I was, but it was before I was out of 4th grade. Since I have been listening to a lot of Shadow Man stories, that has got me thinking and trying to remember my reoccurring nightmare growing up. I was always going into the garage and seeing a dark figure of a man. This was about 25 years ago, so I'm not sure of a lot of the other details, but I'm almost certain now that it was the Shadow Man, because when we left the house, my nightmares stopped. However, if you have any other thoughts, please let me know. Our next story of the night comes to us from Craig, and Craig's story is called Demonic Attack. Craig says, Hello, Nick. I've been listening to your podcast for a few months now, and I'm finally writing in with one of my many encounters. I haven't told many people about this story that I'm about to tell you. It's a little lengthy, but I need to include a bit of backstory. Since a very young age, I have always had strange encounters. It started with the normal odd footsteps, knocking and tapping, seeing dark figures, and so on for many years. I simply disregarded it. Sometime around age 13 or 14, I started to let things in, and I opened up my mind to the paranormal. I started attempting to speak to these figures I've seen, but to no avail. There was just silence as they peered at me, and it never truly scared me because I was so openly intrigued by them all. Around age 16, I was living in the basement of my grandmother's house. Her house was allegedly haunted by the spirit of a young girl who passed away in the basement, so I chose this location to interact with the Ouija board for the first time. Once again, I never got a response. It was as if they simply wanted to view me very frequently, but would never talk to me. After trying the board a few more times without anything, I finally gave up. I started to disregard things again, and I blamed myself for being a little unhinged, so I was imagining things. As I got older, I had 3 children. My middle child is actually the firstborn daughter from her mother, who is actually the firstborn daughter from her mother, and so on. This is important because my wife's family tree traces back to the Salem witches. My middle child, who I will call Kay, always had a wild imagination and expressed having many imaginary friends around the age of 5. Oddly, around the same time I myself had started seeing things. I cannot explain why or how, but her and I started to have the same dreams multiple times per week. None of them ever made any sense to me, and they always took place in locations I was unaware of. In these dreams, she was usually playing with friends and toys, but none of her friends ever had facial features. The only face I could ever see was hers. One dream at some point had started to play on repeat. Every night it was the same thing, but I would gain an extra few seconds before the link would break. These nights, my daughter would wake up in a panic, but not be able to explain anything aside from saying, "I had a nightmare, and a scary man was there." Since I was seeing these dreams but hadn't ever seen a scary man, I played it off as her imagination, until one very bad night. My link to her dream never broke. This night, the dream continued with the little girls running with their toys from room to room. As they ran into the other room and out of my view, I finally saw the scary man she had mentioned. To me, all I saw was a dark and hulking figure with dark red eyes. This figure moved rapidly into the room with the girls, and I took chase. As I came to the doorway, I saw the dark figure about to grab my daughter, and as a father, I felt I had to do something. But how? It's just a dream, right? I yelled out, "Stop! Leave her alone!" And the figure turned to me, and I was immediately overwhelmed with dread and paralyzed in place. The figure then grabbed me by my throat, and then my vision blacked out. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move, and I was stuck somewhere between asleep and awake. During all of this, I had been yelling and flailing enough to wake my wife up, who was sleeping next to me. She had attempted to wake me, but stated that when she attempted to, a deep, demonic voice spoke directly into her mind, exclaiming that if she woke me, it would kill me. She explained to me that my body was cold but covered in sweat, and my body was pressed about 6 inches into the mattress, and I was choking. I was completely helpless, and there was nothing she could do. This was no longer a nightmare, but had become reality. I heard a voice let out a bone-chilling laugh as the hands around my throat finally released. I opened my eyes in a complete panic, and as I took my first deep breath, I felt a very strong tug on my left arm. It was straight up and above my head. I then felt a tear and a very loud pop. The dark figure was not done messing with me. It had dislocated my shoulder and tore the muscles in my shoulder. I have no clue what compelled it to finally let me go, but it wasn't done forever. This was just one of the many encounters with the same figure. After this incident, I have started to get the communication from the other side that I have always wanted at my younger age. Things have yet to cease in my life, but I'll save those for another time. I'm sorry the story was a little long, but I included what I could to help with a little backstory. I love your podcast, and I'm happily a Patreon supporter. Thank you for this wonderful place for everyone to share their experiences. If anyone out there has information that may be able to explain what happened to me that night, feel free to contact me and help me with some form of closure. Thanks again, Nick. I'm very grateful for what you are doing here. As we bring tonight's episode to an end, I'd like to thank all of you for tuning in, and a special thank you goes out to Cassandra, Caroline, Tara, and Craig for sharing their experiences. Have you witnessed something paranormal? If so, I'd like to hear your story. You can share your experience with me through email, voice message, or on our website at paranormalmysteriespodcast.com, and all of these links can be found in the show notes. Until next time, I hope you all have a great weekend, and we'll see you back here on Monday with our next episode. From all of us at Paranormal Mysteries, thank you for listening, and remember, don't wait for the unknown to come to you. Get out there and find it.